Hello and welcome to the podcast of the Prison Officers Association, the UK's largest professional union for prison, correctional and secure psychiatric workers with over 30,000 members. Each month we'll be looking at a different area of the union's work, and in this episode we focus on the role of the private sector in the criminal justice system. Private sector involvement in running prisons dates back to the 1990s, with the first private prison opening at the Wold in 1992. Currently, 14 out of 117 institutions are under the control of private companies, Serco, G4S and Sodexo, and additionally, Mighty Care and Custody have the Home Office contract for immigration detainees, and the union therefore has members on that contract from France to Northern Ireland. POA policy, as determined at annual conference, makes clear the union's scepticism about the value private prisons give, but also that union organising and recognition should be the goal and that appropriate resources must be put into this. At POA headquarters, full-time officers Andy Baxter, Mick Pinlett and Angela Montgomery have responsibility for organising and servicing in private prisons. I'm delighted they've been able to join me on this podcast to talk about their work in this area. Perhaps we could start off by you introducing yourselves and the groups of members you look after.
My name is Andy Baxter. I'm a full-time official with the POA, Assistant General Secretary. I service the Mighty contract within the private sector. Mighty have the contract with the Home Office relating to immigration removal and detainee centres. The POA has full recognition with care and custody across the in-country escorting section of that contract and also within their operational control centre in Northern Ireland. So the majority of my private sector work is linked to Mighty. I also do some crossover work with Serco in relation to the PECS contract they have, which is the prison escort and court services.
Thanks very much. Angela, what's your area of responsibility?
I cover the G4S estates, and that includes detention and training centres for young people. I also cover, because I have the health remit, the private sector within the health forensic psychiatric services. We have recognition for some establishments in G4S, but not all. And in the health private sector, we don't have recognition, but we are building up workplace reps to support members in the health private sector.
Great, thank you very much. And Mick, who do you look after?
I'm the Assistant General Secretary, the same as Angela and Andy. I have responsibility for representation within Serco and also within Sodexo. We currently have recognition rights within Sodexo at HMP Northumberland, but we also have members at Peterborough and Bronzefield, which are also Sodexo-run establishments, but we don't have recognition. So we deal with disciplinaries and grievances at them jails where we don't have recognition. I also have responsibility for Serco establishments. The one Serco establishment that we do have recognition rights for is the Gatwick Immigration Removal Centre. But then again, we also have members within other Serco establishments, which include HMP Doncaster and HMP Loudon Grange, where we have responsibility for representing members in grievance, disciplinaries, and so on and so on.
I think just in what the three of you have said, it's clearly a very complicated, varied environment, not just different employers, but different bargaining units within those employers, almost on a site-by-site basis, and whether or not there's recognition, there's still a job of work that is being done for the members. Now, I mean, ideally, I guess, there wouldn't be privately run prisons or private provision in the custodial services at all. But is there any upside at all for members who work, especially in the newer prisons where the quality of the buildings are better, but then violence against staff is higher? Are there any positives that you can look at that members in the private sector enjoy over their counterparts?
I think there are. I can only speak for G4S, that in terms of recruitment of staff, they do recruit a diverse range of staff, and that's quite evident in relation to the disciplinaries we pick up and just walking around the establishment, that particularly women staff, BAME staff and LGBT plus staff, they seem to recruit a higher proportion. But you do have to remember their pay and conditions aren't as great.
I just think, regarding pay and conditions, though, I think we all acknowledge that private companies were brought into the criminal justice sector because they could offer a cheaper alternative to the public sector. I think what we've seen recently, though, within the public sector, where we have had a pay freeze, is that private companies have not been subject to that pay freeze. And actually, the gap between private sector and public sector is now narrowing. So we know that the government have announced a public sector pay freeze for the forthcoming year for public sector staff. But the staff within the private sector who we represent, we will negotiate a pay deal as part of a collective bargaining agreement, which we don't really have with the public sector. The private sector are not subject to an independent pay review body. So therefore, we can bargain on behalf of our members with companies such as Sodexo and Serco. And for example, a HMP Northumberland that I represent, which is run by Sodexo, we've just balloted on and agreed a 1.5% pay award alongside other benefits, which include health cover, life assurance, and a will writing service. And our members at Gatwick Immigration Removal Centre, which is run by Serco, have recently balloted and agreed a 2% pay rise, the removal of sickness waiting days, and the awarding of premium rates for public holidays. So, yeah, although we can say that their pay and terms and conditions are not as good as the public sector, I think we are making inroads on that. And I think we have been very effective in negotiating benefits for our members, particularly around pay. And the gap is narrowing, I do believe.
If I can add to that, Simon, privatisation of prisons is now 30 years old. Initially, when the private sector was launched, beginning with the Wolds on Humberside, the threat of the private sector was used as a big stick to constantly hit the public sector, the HMPPS. We were constantly threatened with market testing. The market testing threat seems to have relented a little bit. But what we now find is we constantly find the things that Mick picked up on. The private sector pay is used as a yardstick when the peer review body consider making awards for the public sector. So we've had to embrace the private sector. We've had to work with them. And, you know, the inroads, Mick mentioned some decent pay awards. There was a really good pay award to a group of staff on the Mighty contract last year worth 17%. You know, wow. we would be absolutely over the moon if we could achieve those sorts of rises, or even a regular annual rise for the public sector members. But, you know, Mick hit the nail on the head. What we would need to achieve that would be collective bargaining. And I don't think that there's any appetite from the public sector employer or the government to introduce collective bargaining for the public sector.
I was going to say, Serco, Sodexo, G4S, Mighty, the companies that you have to deal with, they don't enjoy good reputations in the public at large, and often it seems with good cause. To what extent are these employers unfamiliar or even hostile to the idea of working with the union simply because they're not used to having to do it?
In my opinion, initially, private companies within the criminal justice sector were reluctant to work with unions and seen as part of the problem regarding employee relations. I think particularly over the last 12 months during the pandemic, I think private companies have realised that the POA are actually the solution or part of the solution and not the problem. I think that the pandemic has shown that partnership working is definitely the way forward. And several issues relating to the pandemic have been resolved due to partnership working with the POA. At the end of the day, the POA are the experts. We've been around for a long time. We've worked within the custodial environment for a long time. And we can bring a lot of benefit to these private companies. And I think it's shown that in the last 12 months. And I hope that the relationships will improve even more as we move forward.
During COVID, we did get, through negotiation and really building up a relationship around partnership working to benefit their business, our members, and those who are being cared for in terms of, and I'll give the G4S example around sick pay. So sick pay was improved in relation the COVID-related issues. And had we not been there, I don't think that would have happened.
Do you think then that there's a difference between the priorities of of staff, your members, the union's members, in privately run prisons or in the privatised parts of the criminal justice system, and those who are still in the state sector? And if so, what do you think they are?
I think it's very, very similar. The pressures that our members in the private sector face are identical to the same sort of pressures in the public sector: violence, lower levels of pay. When I went into the sort of first private prison, it was a real eye-opener, because it could have been an HMPPS prison, it could have been a public sector prison. The things that the staff tell you, the pressures that the staff face. But I think the biggest pressure in the private sector are the lower numbers of staff on duty. The economies of scale, as it were, to put profit into the contract mean that they have lower numbers of staff on duty. And that's something that really doesn't work in any prison environment, because you need to have the numbers of staff on duty to maintain control. You need to have the numbers of staff on duty so you can build the relationships with the prisoners. So, it was almost, what was happening in the private sector was simply duplicating what was happening in the public sector.
Whilst I acknowledge about numbers of staff within the private sector, I think previously private prisons were held in isolation. Nobody knew what was happening in private prisons. I think it was like sort of a guilty secret with the private prisons. I think recently POA have ensured that private prisons are at the forefront of what we're thinking, especially during Whitley negotiations, which is our framework for negotiating consultation with HMPPS. And the POA have ensured that where a new initiative is brought in, such as key working for prisoners, that new initiative should also be happening in private sector prisons. And private sector prisons and private sector prison workers should not be the poor relations in comparison to HMPPS. Now, I know in HMP Northumberland, the introduction of key work has actually brought them in line with their staffing numbers to one of their comparator prisons, which is HMP Risley. So actually, the staffing numbers within HMP Northumberland are similar to their comparator prisons within the public sector. I think there was also something in the past, and then we always had the impression that private sector prisons were more dangerous and more violent than public sector prisons. I agree with Andy. I think the private sector staff want the same thing as what public sector staff want. They want to protect the public, and they want to work in a safe, decent and secure environment. I think that the most recent safety statistics that have recently come out have gone to prove that private establishments are not all bad, and their statistics actually compare favourably with many public sector establishments. So I think it's not just about private versus public. I think it's sometimes about management of that establishment and the way that violence and safety is dealt with. But yeah, I just don't think that the private sector should be classed as the poor relations.
Angela, in the groups of members that you look after, have you noticed that there are differing priorities, or inevitably are they the same priorities? And whatever the government might want to do in contracting out bits of the prison and custodial service, there is a looking across. People do look for comparators, and there is an almost inevitable levelling up process that takes place, simply because staff talk to each other through the union and in many other ways as well.
I think they compare themselves with the public sector. And I would echo what Mick said in terms of pay. Now, in terms of G4S, currently balloting on a pay rise of over 1%. In one of the establishments, that's already been agreed, and that's not being offered to those in the public sector. So in some ways, that does put pressure on the pay review body to pay something, because often the discussion is about, well, in the private sector, this is what they can afford. So, there is a discussion to be had. Well, if they can afford it in the private sector, surely the public sector should match that, and vice versa. From my point of view, the private sector is here to stay. And it's like any organisation, it's as good or bad as the managers. And I think, there are differentials in that. For example, managerial staff in the private sector get paid across the board in terms of their full terms and conditions more than they would get in HMPPS. And I think that is an issue, and you do see managerial staff moving from the public sector to the private sector. Doesn't tend to happen as much the other way around. Stand to be corrected on that, though.
Interesting stuff. So kind of what's on the agenda in terms of what the union wants to achieve in privately run prisons, either on a site-by-site or an employer or sector-wide basis? There's obviously a lot of movement towards closing the pay gap, and there is best practice that maps across from one sector to the other in both directions. But are there any particular, almost like strategic objectives that the union has for its private sector membership?
I just think that the priorities that we have as a union are set for all of our members, and not just whether it's private or whether it's public, whether it's secure healthcare or whether it's immigration removal. The priorities for the union is to promote and protect the interests of our members, whether that be through pay or improving terms and conditions or whatever it may be. The policies of the union are set by annual conference, and every single thing that we do in relation to our work is with the intention of achieving annual conference motions, and that's it basically.
Members, whether they're in the public or private sector, they need to know and feel assured that if they get into difficulty on whatever issue, that a union will support them. And we make no distinction in that in the POA. It doesn't matter whether you work in the private or public sector, you will get that support.
I think it's important to point out actually what Angela just said about you will get the support, because I deal with the legal side of the POA as well, and currently, Brookhouse Immigration Removal Centre at Gatwick is facing a public inquiry over a Panorama programme which took place in 2017, where there was undercover journalists moving around the establishment with a secret camera. Obviously, our members within Brookhouse will need legal representation in that public inquiry. We don't know how many of our members will be required to attend, but that potentially could cost the union hundreds of thousands of pounds for representation for their members. But that makes no difference. The POA will pay it. And the POA are the only union who will be able to represent their members with appropriate representation legally, whether that be through a barrister or whatever. The POA is the only union that can foot that legal bills such as those.
It's about the specialism within the representation that is so unique about the services that the POA offer. A priority for me is to extend recognition within the private sector, because that then allows us to extend our network of workplace representatives. I'm sure my colleagues will agree. We've got where we have recognition. We have recognition in the majority of the private sector. Now we are able to build these networks, and these networks of workplace representatives are absolutely vital in having a thumb on the pulse of what's happening locally, what's going on in the ground. And I think a lot of managers now in the private sector actually appreciate a little bit of union pushback. They enjoy a little bit of challenge, and it's good that they are prepared to work with the POA, and they are prepared to sort of open the doors a little bit more and be a little bit more transparent than they have been in the last 30 years.
I think that brings us to very nearly the end of what's been a fascinating discussion. If I could ask each of you in one or two sentences, what would your message be to anyone in the privatised parts of the criminal justice system who isn't a POA member? What would your one or two sentences be about what they should do about that?
If I can go first, I think that the shape of the private prisons in the next few years will change dramatically. The first three PFI prisons, Park, Loudham Grange and Alt Course, are up for retender. I think we'll see a dramatic reshaping of prison privatisation. And I would say to the members, the POA are the one constant. The POA are here before privatisation, we're here through privatisation, and we will be there regardless of any change.
Nick, Angela, anything to add to that? It's a bit difficult to add to that, I think. It says it all.
Prison officers, particularly in the private sector, do a challenging and demanding job. Why would you not join a union and be insured for going to work?
And Mick, final word to you.
I think the POA provide the best representation, no matter where you work in the criminal justice sector. Just to reiterate, the legal support that's provided to our members, whether that be for employment law, death in custodies, police investigations, whatever that may be. In the last financial year, the POA spent over £1 million of members' funds to represent our members. And again, we are the only union within the criminal justice sector who can afford to represent our members in that way. No other union can do that. So I would urge all people who are not members of the POA to make it a priority to join the POA as soon as possible.
Angela, Andy, Mick, thank you very much indeed.
So the message is clear. The union can and does make a real difference to the working lives of prison officers, wherever they work and whoever they work for. So if you haven't signed up yet, speak to your local POA rep or head over to poauk.org.uk to find out how to join and all the information about the union and the work that it does. Thank you for listening to the POA podcast. We hope you like what you've heard and will join us for the next edition. Until then, thank you and goodbye. The POA podcast is presented by me, Simon Sapper. Music is by Scott Holmes.